If you're thinking about buying in 2026, or you're stuck in the idea of just renting for another year, this video is going to help you to make that decision and can potentially help you save tens of thousands of dollars. I'm seeing clients make the wrong decisions on both sides. I've seen people rush into buying when they're not ready, and I've seen people wait on the sidelines and miss out on opportunity after opportunity, paying somebody else's mortgage, paying somebody else's interest. And realistically, mistakes on both sides are expensive. So in this video, I'm going to break down if buying makes sense, if renting makes sense. We'll talk about a few examples, see what's going to be a smarter move. And hopefully, after you watch this, you have a better idea or understanding on what's going to be the right decision for you and for your family. Renting or buying in 2026, there isn't no one size fits all. The market in 2026 is a lot different than it was in 2020, 2021. Back in 2020, 2021, it wasn't buy or rent, it was buy as fast as you can. Versus now, with where rates are, with where home values are, with where inflation is, you kind of have to look at it a little bit differently and see what's going to make the most sense for you today. So let's start with the reality. Let's start with what's happening now. Rates are higher than they were. Home values are still high. Home prices are still extremely expensive in a lot of these markets, and homes are still going over asking, even with theoretical less demand out there. Inventory is still tight in a lot of markets, especially the good ones. And rent is definitely expensive, but I would say it's more stable now. It's not skyrocketing, it's not plummeting. You're kind of at a stability point, but it's not cheap. When you pay rent, you're paying somebody else's mortgage payment. You're paying somebody else's interest or somebody else's retirement. You're paying for something. So realistically, buying today definitely feels more expensive than it was before, and you're not wrong. Your payment's going to be higher and your down payment's going to be higher. So it's definitely more expensive than it used to be. I remember when I bought my first house was in 2015. It's a 3-bedroom, 1.5 bath. I bought it for $115,000. A handful of years later, I was able to sell it for over almost double of what I paid for it. When it comes to renting versus buying, I think people sometimes look at it the wrong way. They look at it through one lens. So for example, somebody says, hey, I'm paying rent $2,200 or I could buy it for $2,600. Well, renting is cheaper, right? So I'm gonna stick to renting. It's not that simple. You have to look into consideration on how you make decisions. It's just not simple of dollar, okay? You have to look at it in a bigger scale. So we're gonna talk about a couple things. When buying makes sense, when renting makes sense, so on and so forth. So here's where buying makes sense, okay? There's a handful of items. One of them, you found an area, you're staying put. You don't plan to move for 3 to 5 years. You're gonna grow into this home or potentially plan to grow out of the home. If you're gonna be there long term, it makes sense to buy. All the money that you're investing into living there is at least goes towards your equity, goes towards the appreciation of the property versus just going to somebody else's equity and appreciation. You might as well put it towards yourself, especially for that time, because it's not 1 year, 2 years, it's 3, 5 years, 6 years even. Real estate's a long game. Well, most people, aside from a couple pocket years over time, real estate doesn't typically appreciate more than a few percentage points every year. So you have to be in it long enough, to see those gains, right? Let me give an example. If real estate appreciates at 5% a year on a $200,000 house, that's $10,000 a year of appreciation. So if you bought a house for $200, by the time you hit year 5, you're at 10% the first year, that's $210,000. Then next year, call it another just over $10,000, maybe $12,000. The year after that, same thing. By the time you sell the house, if it just appreciates at 5 years, as it kind of normally does, you're in a situation to where the house may at least worth $250, $260 by the time you sell it. That's your appreciation. Yes, you paid interest over that same time, but now you have all that appreciation, and all that additional equity that you didn't have when you purchased the home. Here's a good example. Sorry, I'm referring to my notes here. I had a client in their mid-20s. They were renting for about $2,000 a month. He kept saying, I'm gonna wait for rates to go down. He waited and he waited. And the reality is, 2 years later, everything he was looking at is up $40,000, $50,000. So the same homes that he could have purchased a few years later are now more expensive by $30,000, $40,000. And he's been paying rent for that same time. So now add in all that wasted money. So 2 years at $2,000, that's $48,000 worth of rent payments. Plus, the home is now worth or selling for $40,000 more than it was 2 years prior. So if you ask me, he's lost $88,000 by waiting. Sure, rates have been higher, but he wouldn't have paid $88,000 in additional interest in that same 2 years. Something to consider. And his rent went up. It may have been $2,000, but it probably ended at like $2,300, $2,200. So who knows, what it caused them. Waiting doesn't always save you money. Sometimes it just, realistically just delays the inevitable. There's a saying that says, time in the market is better than timing the market. So keep that in mind. So get in the market, take on that appreciation. Even if home prices dip for a year, they always come up. That's just how it is. Just ride it out. If you're not leaving in a year, 2 years, there's no sense in renting. Number 2, this kind of goes back into what I was saying earlier, paying somebody else's mortgage. When you have a house, you're building equity in your home. Every payment that you make, even though it may be small, part of it goes towards your principal. It goes paying down that debt. So every single month, you're building equity. Every single month, your home is appreciating. So you're paying down debt and the home's appreciating. You're going to have a lot more equity built up over time than if you were to rent, obviously, which builds no equity. And here's another story. Client named Jim. He bought a house 3 years ago. The house is worth about $60,000 more than what he paid for it. He didn't do anything different. He didn't change anything in his property. Or I shouldn't say it's worth more. He has $60,000 more in equity than he did when he bought it because he's paid down every month and the house appreciated. So over the course of 3 years, he's built $60,000 of equity in his home. He didn't do anything. He didn't feel it. He didn't go out of his way, anything like that. It's just natural progression of being, in a home purchase. One thing with buying a home, we've talked about this before, is stable income creates more consistency, and stable income matters more than high income. So knowing what your payment's going to be every month, knowing what your bills are going to be a month is definitely stronger than just being able to earn X amount of income or a certain high amount of dollars. Because, and this could be just an opinion, but the peace of mind you have when you know, hey, I make, let's just for example say $6,000 a month. At $6,000 a month, my bills are $3,000, and that's every month. I always preach stick to a budget. So if your bills are $3,000, you make $6,000. You're in a situation to where it's stable, it's consistent. Owning a home, you know what your payment's going to be every month. It's going to be a lot more peace of mind, a lot more comfortable living, and you'll be in a situation to where you're not wondering, or if rent goes up or whatever it may be, things like that, or having to move, along that nature. Again, owning a home, you have control over your home. You want to move a wall? Sure. You want to paint? Sure. You want to do a back patio? Sure. You can do what you want because it's yours. There are some rules and some stipulations if you live like an HOA or a condo. Yeah, sure. But at the end of the day, it's still yours. You want to paint your walls hot pink? Do it. It's your house. Nobody can tell you not. If you want to hang up a photo, do it. Just things like that. Change the carpets, change the flooring, change the cabinets. You can do that because it's yours. You have control over that property. It's your asset. So here's something we're going to dip into where renting can be smarter. Let's say here, Ferris, I'm thinking about buying, but I'm not going to be here long term. Typically ask, well, how long do you plan to be in the home? If you tell me a year to 2 years, I'm going to tell you, unless you're getting a really good deal, buying may not make sense. Between your down payment and closing costs, you're forking over a good chunk of change to theoretically be out in a year or two. In a year or two, you're not going to have time on your side in regards to appreciation. So putting yourself in a situation to where you're out short term, buying may not be the move because you need time in the market, time for the home to appreciate, time to build equity. You may just be putting in a ton of money and you're selling the property for what you bought it for or less because of just the small amount of time they've been in it. And don't forget too, when you sell a property, you're going to have more likely to have an agent sell it for you and an agent buy it from you. So the home needs to appreciate at least at a bare minimum 6% from what you purchase it for, because you're going to be paying that out in commissions. If your property didn't appreciate, that's coming out of your pocket. You're going to end up losing money. It's going to come out of the equity that you put down. So keep that in consideration. Oh, here's a big one. And I say this, I preach this all the time. Don't buy just to buy. Don't overdo your budget. Who cares what your friends are doing? Who cares if people talk and say, oh, this guy's always renting? It doesn't matter. Keep yourself in a situation where you're comfortable. Keep yourself in a situation to where you're able to not be house poor. You have the expenses of a home. The window breaks, you got to replace it. You want to change your floors, you have to pay for it. Renting does allow for you to be a little bit more flexible with your money because you're not responsible for anything that comes up in the property, right? You got a leaky faucet or bad plumbing, your landlord pays for that. Your roof is leaking, your landlord pays for that. So those aren't your expenses that you have to deal with. So it kind of just allows for you to be a little bit more stable in your income with that. You never want to stretch yourself out too thin. I had a personal story when I owned a condo. AC went out right at the beginning of summer. Who's got to pay for that? Cost me a couple grand to get a guy out there because now I need him on a rush and he knows it because it's summertime. It's a couple $1,000s to get my AC fixed. And if it was a landlord, they would have to foot that bill. Something to consider. One thing with renting that may help is, sometimes people value flexibility. You're young. Some people like to travel. Like they just like to go and spend time in other countries or other places or other cities. You can do that if you're renting. If you're renting, you're not tied to anything long term. You can bounce around. You have that flexibility, especially nowadays with so many people working from home. You're in a situation to where you can work from home or work remote, I should say, and work anywhere, right? So if you're not going to be somewhere, this goes back to being somewhere long term. If you're like, hey, I'm going to bounce around. I'm going to go live in Thailand for 6 months. I'm going to go see how it is in Vietnam. And because you work remote, you can do that. You have that luxury. Buying may not be the move for you. I know this sometimes sounds funny, but I wrote it down, is you don't just want to own yet. And what I mean by that is you don't want to take on that responsibility and the headache and the work and being tied down. It's okay to not want to own anything, to not want to own a home at this point in your life. Maybe later on it makes more sense. But if you don't want to own it, then don't own it. Don't tie yourself to it where you're stuck and now you're solely responsible for everything. You don't have to. So something to take into consideration, you have to be mentally ready to own a home. So we talked about this a little bit earlier and we're kind of going to go down into the numbers, right? So let's go back to the example. Rent is $2,200, but your mortgage payment is $2,600. And you say to me, Ferris, well, renting is cheaper. Well, let's break that down, okay? Because part of your $2,600 is going towards your paying down your loan. home. So you're going to get it back in equity. And again, I always say this over and over again, potential appreciation. I want you to think not what's cheaper and what's going to help you build your future. That's the way to think about it, because renting may save you $400 a month, but over 5 years, you have nothing. Over 5 years at $400 a month savings, you're talking maybe 20 grand or 25 grand in theoretical savings versus the amount of appreciation you get from buying a property, from owning a property, right? And the equity you could have built from owning a property. More often than not, especially if you're buying a property for $300,000, for example, at 5%, you're appreciating at $15,000 a year at minimum. So at $15,000, I shouldn't say at minimum, for normal appreciation. $15,000 over the course of 2 years, that's $30,000. That's more than your savings you had in rent over the same 2 years. So you have to take that into consideration. So again, to reiterate, my framework for clients is, or just to talk about and think about, is how long are you staying in the property? That's a big one. Here's one that I talk about here and there. Have emergency savings. Whether you're buying a home or renting, make sure you have emergency savings, 3 months, 6 months at least of rent payments, or your bills is always safe. You know, God forbid something happens, you lose your job. You don't want to be in a situation where you have 30 days to figure it out and replace your income. Because sometimes it may not be that feasible. There's people getting laid off that are super educated, super experienced, you know, so you don't want to be in a situation where that happens. You don't want to spend every dollar you have purchasing. Is your income stable? You know, you don't want to see this. You don't want to be a job hopper. You know, we've talked about that. There's nothing worse than making a certain dollar amount for so long and now you're making, you know, less, or, you know, it yo-yos. It's just not good for you. It's not going to help you qualify. It's not going to help you be comfortable. You know, all those things play a factor. And then realistically, do you want to own? You know what I mean? Like, you have to want to own. You have to want to take on that responsibility, that additional work, that additional stress. You know, you have to be on top of things. So you have to really think to yourself and really hunker down and say, hey, what's worth it to me right now? Renting or buying? And only you can really tell yourself that. The worst reason to buy is if you feel like you have to, or feel that you're supposed to, because you're not. You have to do what's right for you in that given situation. Long story short, guys, if you're trying to figure out is renting or buying and you want somebody to go over the numbers with, you know, give me a call. Let me know. We'll go over your situation together. We'll see, you know, what makes sense for you. If it doesn't make sense for you to buy right now, I'm going to tell you. You know, I tell my clients all the time, especially the ones that want to buy for their entire purchase price or pre-approval amount. I tell them all the time, hey, right now may not be the moment. You know, let's look at something else. Let's see what we can do. And maybe we'll just game plan for a year, 2 years from now. You know, we can walk through that. You know, drop me a message, drop me a comment, take a look at some other videos and see what makes sense for you. Like, subscribe, the whole shebang. Thanks, guys. Here are 10 things that you may not know that you should be doing before and during the mortgage process. Number 1, pre-approved versus pre-qualified. Guys, I've talked about this a million times.